ለመማር ወደ ትምህርት ተቋም መሄድ ግድ አይደለም።
ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
ራሳችሁን ከኮሮና ቫይረስ ወረርሽኝ እየጠበቃችሁ በቤታችሁ ወይም በተመቻችሁ ቦታ
በኢንተርኔት አማካኝነት በኦንላይን ትምህርታችሁን መከታተል ይቻላል።
ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና
ከእንግሊዙ ኢንስቲትዩት ኦፍ ኮመርሻል ማኔጅመንት ICM ጋር በመተባበር የሚሰጡ ትምህርቶችን ተከታትላችሁ በ6 ወር ጊዜ በዓለም አቀፍ ደረጃ ተቀባይነት ያለውን የስልጠና ማስረጃ ባለቤት መሆን ይቻላል።
ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና ባገኘንባቸው የፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን እና የሆስተስ ስልጠናም በምዝገባ ላይ ነን።
ጥያቄና መልስ፣ የክፍል ስራዎች ብሎም ፈተና መፈተን ክፍል ውስጥ እንዳላችሁ አይነት
ልምድ ባላቸው መምህራን እየተማራችሁ
በኦንላይን ባላችሁበት ቦታ
አድራሻ ከ22 ማዞሪያ ወደ ሾላ ገበያ በሚወስደው መንገድ 150 ሜትር ገባ ብሎ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ
ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
We are going to cover the fourth chapter, which is about the monetary policy targets and rules. If there is any problem, you can inbox me. The chapter objective is you are expected to understand what the specific monetary policy instruments are, and you are also expected to understand the goals of monetary policy. Therefore, this chapter has two broad objectives, by which at the end of this chapter you are expected to really understand the policy implications or the practicability of the monetary policy instruments. And we will also cover the goals of monetary policy. And at the end of the session, you will have group discussion. Therefore, you have to follow attentively. First is the introductory part. This introductory part tells you how the monetary policy instruments are evolving across period in different nations, particularly in advanced nations. And it tells you the historical background of the monetary policy, which monetary policy was initially introduced, and later which follows, and why this happens. These issues are addressed under the introductory section. And historically, most of the central banks have had the mandate to pursue number of macroeconomic goals. And this historical traceback shows you that the principal macroeconomic goals were the price stability, the concern of having the optimal level of unemployment, and the high economic growth in general. In this session, we may use the term central bank and national bank interchangeably. Therefore, understand me that these texts, as you know, are written by the Westerns, and largely the textbooks use the case of the UK, which they have the central bank. Therefore, central bank, when I say central bank, you can equivalently use it as the National Bank of Ethiopia. And the achievement of the multiple goals. Here, the multiple goals might be, for instance, pricing stability, low unemployment, and high growth. All this will be possible if we have a very concise and strong policy tool that can jointly attain these macroeconomic goals. And the historical background of these goals indicates that largely since the early 1990s, many of the economists had been suggesting the inflation targeting as a basic monetary policy instrument. However, with the coming of the Taylor rule, which embodies a trade-off between inflation and that of output, changes the way how the economists have been looking into the policy instruments. As a result, the trade-off between the division of this inflation and the output, the desired output as the load graph, have given the possibility of looking for alternative monetary policy instruments than focusing only on the inflation targeting. Therefore, in the 1970s, a radical shift was happened with the great impact of the St. Louis monetarism. Therefore, only the inflation targeting as a policy instrument was not leading to a success in most of the countries. As a result, the Western countries, most of the Western countries have tried to look into their reserve requirements. And what they did is they put the reserve requirements to the level that is closer to zero, which eliminates the importance of the reserve requirements as a tool of monetary policy. As a result, there happens a change again in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, the most common tool of monetary policy still in developing economies or in advanced nations have been a change in interest rate, which is backed by or supported by the change in monetary supply that was induced by the open market operations. Having discussed this historical background of moving from the interest rate targeting to other alternatives such as open market operations, now we are moving to the current ways that particularly addresses the policy instrument of the contemporary central banks or national banks in our case are using. And broadly, the theory has put the monetary policy instruments to be divided into two main types. One is the direct control, and the other is the indirect control. Now, let's first see what were the monetary policy instruments that are used as a direct control. This direct control are typically directives given by the central bank to control the quantity or the price of money which is deposited in the commercial banks. Therefore, this direct control is the direct intervention of the central bank, or in our case, the national bank, in controlling the price of the money which is deposited in the commercial banks. And this direct control has still a possibility of controlling directly the amount of credit provided by the commercial banks. I hope you know how money supply is related with credit, right? Therefore, this direct control by the central bank, or in our case by the national bank, is a direct control on the operation of the commercial banks. And this direct control can be exemplified with controlling the price of the money that commercial banks have. It is also expressed in terms of the control on the amount of credit they will provide to their customers. As a result, this direct control might be justified by putting ceilings on the bank lending or on the bank deposits. Therefore, these ceilings are a direct control on the amount of or on the quantity of money itself. That is why we say it's direct controls. Moreover, I have already mentioned it. The central bank might also put a maximum lending or deposit rates, which are also examples of the interest control. Interest is, as you know, the price of the money, right? The other one is the indirect instruments. These indirect instruments are usually practiced under financially liberalized economies. Of course, though the degree of practicability differs, it is also practiced in developing nations. And this indirect policy instrument, that is a monetary policy instrument, is focusing on the promotion of efficient allocation of saving and credit in the entire economy. Therefore, these indirect policy instruments in the monetary arena are of financial liberalization, which involves a movement from a direct control towards that of the indirect ones. And this indirect monetary policy instruments are operated by the central banks or the national banks. How? Maybe by controlling the amount of supply of their liabilities, for instance. For instance, the reserve money. And this reserve money, a control on the reserve money, have an indirect effect on the interest rates. And this reserve money as well has a direct effect, an indirect effect on the quantity of money. And of course, the credit. And of course, the credit. And we can literatures classify these indirect monetary policy instruments basically into three. In different texts, you may find out different breakout. For the purpose of this session, we can use the classification into three. The first indirect monetary policy instrument is the open market operations. The central bank influences the amount of money supply in the economy using the open market operations. What does it mean? It doesn't directly control on the amount of money to be distributed. Rather, the central bank, or in our case, the national bank, uses different alternative securities for exchanging money with those specified securities. For instance, if the national bank assumes that the money supply circulated in the economy is small, what it did is it buys securities, meaning the national bank will have the security and the other banks or will have the money in place of that. As a result, the national bank can possibly increase or raise the money supply through open market operations. In the same fashion, the central bank can also reduce the money supply by selling securities. When the central bank or the national bank sells securities, for instance, bonds is usually for financing some investments. It is to mean that it reduces or it lowers the money supply. And generally, we can say that in the open market operations, buying of securities amounts to the printing of new money. And the buying of the securities have the possibility of lowering the supply of those specific securities. That is to mean that. The second is the reserve requirement. You have to know that these instruments are being in place by the national bank or by the central banks of the respective countries. Therefore, the authority is for the central banks. And the second instrument is therefore reserve requirement. This reserve requirement affects the money supply. You have to know that these central banks are trying to control indirectly through the reserve requirements, and they are controlling the money supply. For instance, depending on the amount of money supplied in the economy, the national bank or the central banks might adjust the amount of money supply using the reserve requirements. For instance, the central bank might rise in reserve requirements. Then it will reduce the amount of deposit that can be supported by a given level of the monetary base. Therefore, a rise in reserve requirements has a contractionary effect on the money supply, meaning those commercial banks are required to put a portion of their deposit in the form of reserve requirement. Therefore, if the central bank demands them or increases the reserve requirements, it contracts the money supply. As opposed to this, a decline in reserve requirement leads to the expansion of the money supply, because you know that the decline in reserve requirement gives more freedom to the commercial banks to give more credit, for instance, for more loan, which have a possibility of creating more multiple deposit creation. Therefore, reserve requirement is the second option of the monetary policy instrument. The third is the discount policy. Discount policy. Someone is in the waiting room. Let me admit him. Discount policy. This is to mean the interest rate that the national bank charges on the commercial bank. And specifically, the discounting policy is a policy tool which is taken by the central banks that can enable him control the money circulation, and it has a possibility of rising or lowering the interest rate, and the adjustment is through the interest rate. For instance, if the central bank raises bank rates, then it will help to reduce the money supply in the economy. Therefore, principally, this discount policy involves changes in the discount rate, which affects the money by affecting the volume of the discount loans in the monetary base in general. And you can see the direction of relationship between discount policy with the amount of the money supply. For instance, a rise in the discount loans will add to the monetary base, and this rise in discount loans expands the monetary. And a fall in the discount loans reduces the monetary base and then shrinks the money supply in general. Therefore, the action of the central bank depends on its policy aim. And you have to, I hope you have to clearly understand how these indirect monetary policy instruments can be in place for adjusting the money supply. The other question is, though it is mandated for the central bank, how far these policy instruments can be in place? How far these policy instruments can be effective? And though there are a number of factors which affects its degree of success. Principally, this slide tells you the importance of independence, the importance of being free from any intervention, maybe from political affiliates. Therefore, one critical factor that affects the success of or the effectiveness of these monetary policy instruments is the degree of freedom or the degree of independence of the central banks in pursuing these policy instruments. Therefore, the maybe economic growth, price stability, unemployment might be set by the government. The way how these monetary policy instruments will have an effect on the goals should be given for experts who are working in national bank or central banks. Therefore, the government can set the goals of unemployment rate, the goals of economic growth, the goals of inflation like that, or price stability. However, the policy instruments, the monetary policy instruments would have to be left to the central banks. Therefore, the central banks could have adequate scope to pursue the goals that have been set. And generally, is the concern of freedom. Central banks or national bank should have the instruments independence. What is your observation to the case of Ethiopia? Do you think that the national bank is being managed by experts with no great influence from the government bodies, for instance? Does the national bank have the freedom to set the monetary policy instruments for achieving the goals, the economic goals that are set by the government, for instance? So the independence, but I'm critical no the point. Okay. Once you understand the monetary policy instruments, now we are going to see the goals and the targets. It is always that the understanding of the conduct of monetary policy is important because it not only affects the money supply, right, and interest rate, but also the monetary policy has an influence or an effect on the entire economy and hence the general well-being of the economy. As a result, there could be a connection point between the monetary policy instruments and that of the economic goals or economic activity or well-being in general. As a result, we have to look into the goals that the central banks establish for monetary policy and what are their strategies for attaining them. Therefore, we could have the understanding of the interlinkage. As a result, you may find out different numbers in different texts, but for the sake of this discussion, I have brought you 6 goals of monetary policy. Therefore, the National Bank might adjust the amount of money supply using different policy instruments. Is the application of these policy instruments, is it the end target? What is the goal? Therefore, the goals of the monetary policy can be classified into 6 for our case. For attaining high level of employment, for securing a good and stable economic growth, for securing price stability, interest stability, stability of the financial market in general, and stability in the foreign exchange market. Therefore, these are the 6 goals of the monetary policy of the central banks. If there is a problem in the sound or something, you can text me, okay? And now let's see each of the goals of the monetary policy. ስለዚህ አሁን ናሽናል ባንክ በተለያየ መንገድ መኒ ሳፕላዩን አጀስት ያደርጋል። ስለዚህ የመጨረሻ ዓላማው ምንድን ነው? money supply ይጨንሳል መጨመር ይችላል መቀነስ ይችላል በተለያዩ ኢንስትሩመንቶች በዳይሬክት and indirect ብለን ባየናቸው ማለት ነው ስለዚህ ያ የመጨረሻው ታርጌቱ ምንድነው what is the target we are going to this therefore the first goal is the high employment it is obvious that all nations would like to achieve a high level of employment, which they set it as a principal macroeconomic or macroeconomic objective. And securing a high level of employment is important for many reasons. Among these reasons, let's see two critical points. Having high level of employment is very important because the other option or the other scenario that is having high unemployment has the possibility of creating a misery, a human misery. And it will result in the loss of citizens' self-respect. It can also result in crime, for instance. But you have to understand that the empirical evidences of the link between high employment and crime does not always be negative. However, it is you can understand that more of crimes might happen if there are large volume of unemployed houses. If you open Ethiopian media, for instance, the crime is getting high and high because of the large volume of unemployment in Ethiopia. It may be, and it may not be. Therefore, the relationship between high employment and low level of crime might be, or the other way around, might be controversial. But still, it is good to have a high level of employment. The other reason of having high level of employment is we are talking about labor, right? Labor is a resource, right? I hope those of you who have taken the economics, you know the four factors of production, right? Among these is labor, right? Therefore, labor as a principal input is very important for the economy. And having high level of unemployment means you have idle resource, unused resource, which has a possibility of reducing the GDP, right?
በትምህርት ከፍ ብሎ መብረር ይቻላል። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ከከፍተኛ ትምህርት አግባብነትና ጥራት ኤጀንሲ ሙሉ ዕውቅናን ባገኘንባቸው በማስተርስ ዲግሪ ኤምቢኤ በስትራቴጂክ ማኔጅመንት፣ ኤምቢኤ በባንኪንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ ኤምቢኤ በቢዝነስ ሊደርሺፕ፣ ኤምቢኤ በሪስክና ኢንሹራንስ፣ ኤምኤስሲ በኢንተርናሽናል ትሬድ እና ኢኮኖሚክስ ዘርፎች በእውቀት ለመቅረጽ የበቁ ፕሮፌሰሮቻችን አረንጓዴ መብራታቸውን አብርተዋል። በነገራችን ላይ በኬንያ ሀገር ከሚገኙ ስመጥር ዩኒቨርሲቲዎች በሚመጡ ፕሮፌሰሮች የትኩረት መስክ ትምህርቶቹ መሰጠታቸው ልዩ ያደርገናል። በምርጥ የትምህርት ስርዓት የተገነባው ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ በመጀመሪያ ዲግሪ በአቪዬሽን ማኔጅመንት፣ በሆቴል ማኔጅመንት፣ በአካውንቲንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ በማርኬቲንግ ማኔጅመንት አስተማማኝ ትምህርት ይገቢውና ራስዎንና ሀገሮን ይለውጡ። አድራሻ 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
the question that economists put is, therefore, how do you describe high level of employment? And how high should it be? And what's the point that we say the economy is at full employment? The answer for this question from the literatures is put as having full level of employment. And people understand full employment as a point where there is no worker out of job. Or when they say that when unemployment is zero, all people are, or labor is employed. However, this is not the case. And in reality, this cannot happen. This cannot happen. Why? There are a number of reasons for this justification. One, it disregards the frictional unemployment. Even sometimes you may be employed somewhere else, but it might not match for you, and you may look into shifting to the other job positions. And in the meantime, for a specific period of time, you will be unemployed, right? You will be unemployed. Therefore, this frictional unemployed cannot be zero. Therefore, as people are moving for a job, a better position, or a better job, they might be temporarily unemployed. Therefore, the concept of full employment has missed this context. And the other reason why unemployment cannot be zero is people might, or labor might leave, L-E-A-V-E, their work for the time being, just for the purpose of maybe for raising their children or their family, maybe for joining to school, or they might still look into different vacant positions, right? That fits for them. And in the meantime, these individuals might be unemployed. Therefore, unemployment cannot be zero. Therefore, the policy target of putting zero level of unemployment is not real in the real world. We cannot have zero level of unemployment in the economy. And still, the other reason for justifying why unemployment cannot be zero is due to structural unemployment. Sometimes there might be a mismatch between your graduated profession or the skills you have and what is available on the market, what is available in the job market. Therefore, this justifies that unemployment cannot be zero in the economy. ስለዚህ መንግስት unemployment zero አደርጋለሁ ቢል it is completely out of the context. Therefore, we are talking that the monetary policy instruments have a role in reducing unemployment. And when putting this goal, we have to set our level of unemployment above zero, which we may put it as consistent with full employment, at which the labor demand equals to the labor supply. Labor demand equals labor supply. And the point where labor demand equals to labor supply is termed as the natural rate of the unemployment. Therefore, our target would have to be consistent with this. The second is the economic growth. The second goal is economic growth. Here, you have to understand that each goal might be closely related. For instance, economic growth can be closely related to employment, right? Because it is the economy would have to be grown by employing people, which have the possibility of increasing productivity, right? With the reduction of the unemployment. And if there is high level of unemployment, labor is idle, therefore it has the possibility of having a stagnant economic growth. As a result, the economic growth and employment can be encouraged or can be promoted, for instance, by the encouragement of saving, which this saving will have to be converted into firms' investment. And this firm's investment will have a likelihood of employing labor. Therefore, some economic goals, some goals are closely related. And we have the possibility of still advancing our investment, and hence the economic growth through the supply side policies. For instance, the tax policy has a strong effect on boosting or retarding the business growth. The other goal is the price stability. I hope you are tired of hearing the unstable price in the economy, right? Inflation, right? And it creates uncertainty in the economy. And it has a penalizing effect on economic growth. Therefore, one of the targets would have to be the stabilization of the price. And empirical evidences are showing that unstable price and a very unstable price has led to lower economic growth. I'm admitting someone. Therefore, you can predict or you can interpret the price of goods and services in the economy because you are uncertain because of the unstable price in the economy. Therefore, it makes a complication for decision makers for consumers, for businessmen, or for government in general. And one of the examples that has a hampering effect on the economy is and of course, the example of high level of inflation is the hyperinflation. And this is experienced by Argentina, Brazil, and even Zimbabwe, right? Zimbabwe. And this unstable price makes it difficult to plan for the future. For instance, አሁን የዋጋ ስቴቢሊቲ ከሌለ ለምሳሌ አሁን የልጆች የትምህርት ክፍያ for instance የቤት ግዢ anything any transaction it makes for you uncertain for the future. It makes difficult for you to plan. How much fund you would have to put for that specific transaction or activity. It will be uncertain if the price is not stable. Moreover, inflation has also the possibility of distorting the social fabric. For instance, two groups might be created. For instance, buyers and sellers, right? And the seller tries to secure high level of profit, and the buyer again will look into earn another possible income, which finally leads to the chaos, instabilities, or a problem in the general social fabric, or even conflict. ስለዚህ በጨመረው ፕራይስ ልክ ገቢን ለማሳደግ ሲባል በተለያየ መልኩ ኮንፍሊክት ሀፕን የሚያደርግ ይችላል። There will be a conflict, unhealthy competition among the different groups of the society, and might be conflict. As a result, having a stable price is very important goal. The other is the interest rate stability. If the economy doesn't have a proper stabilized interest rate, still it creates uncertainty and it creates a difficulty to plan for the future. For instance, there might be individuals who are interested to buy a house. If there is a fluctuation in interest rate, it will affect the willingness to invest in the specific purchase, for instance. And it will also be difficult for entrepreneurs. How many houses would have to without the bill? As a result, the central bank, when these uncertainties, when these problems are happening in the economy, and if there is a problem for planning for the future because of the existing, the volatility or the changing in interest rate in the economy, it will greatly penalize the economy. As a result, here comes the importance of the national bank or the central bank for keeping a stabilized interest rate in the economy. Stability of the financial markets. The stable financial market is still important. The stability of the financial markets for channeling funds to proper funding or channeling funds to proper investments is very important. If there is a financial crisis, it will hamper the financial flow to the productive investments, for instance. Therefore, there could be stability of the financial markets, which is still possible through the central or the national banks. And the empirical evidence, I hope you remember the 2008 or around that, the financial crisis in US, right? What it has brought an instability within the entire economy. And it is also evidenced in the 1980s and 1990s. At that time, the more pronounced interest rate fluctuation have been particularly severe problem for saving and loan associations as well as the mutual saving banks, particularly in the 1980s and the 1990s. The other is the stability in the foreign exchange market. Foreign exchange market. For instance, the exchange between dollar and birr. አሁን የዶላር እና የብር ግንኙነት ፎሪን ኤክስቼንጅ ላይ ስቴብል ካልሆነ ኢኮኖሚ ውስጥም በጣም ከፍተኛ ችግር ይፈጥራል። it would have to be stable. ምክንያቱም የሰዎችን ኢንቨስትመንት የሰዎችን ፊውቸር ፕላን ዲስቶርት ያደርጋል because they don't know what will be the foreign exchange rate between the domestic currencies and that of the foreign currency. As you know, this foreign exchange market for currencies is important for international trade, right? And it has a multiplier effect within the economy. And it has also an implication on the degree of competitiveness of the domestic firms with the outsides. And it has also the implication on the purchasing power of people abroad and in the domestic. What will happen if the foreign exchange market is destabilized, meaning changing every time with no possibility of projection. As a result, the stabilizing of the extreme movements in the value of a dollar in the foreign exchange market is considered as a very important goal of the monetary policy. ክርክር አለ አሁን በኢትዮጵያ እና በአይኤምኤፍ መካከል ኢቨን ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ባሉ ምሁራን ኤክስቼንጅ ሬቱን ፍሪ ማድረግ የኢትዮጵያን ገንዘብ የመግዛት አቅም ዝቅ ማድረግ ምናምን ክርክሮች አሉ። But the important point that you have to know here is that Ethiopian government has consistently devalued the Ethiopian currency birr, right? But still, the inflationary pressure is increasing across town, and the import hasn't decreased. The import-export balance has not yet get a remedy through this exchange rate adjustment. One of the critical factors for the reason behind this is the export of developing nations, particularly Ethiopia, is agricultural outputs. By nature, the price of these agricultural commodities is inelastic, meaning whether you reduce the price of coffee, the price of hides or skins, it doesn't have a high level of response in the consuming nations abroad. ቡና ዋጋው ቀነሰ ከዶላር አንፃር ለነሱ ለውጮች ቀነሰ አልቀነሰ የአግሪካልቸራል ኮሚዲቲ ፕራይስ ኢላስቲክ አይደለም። በፊትም አንድ ቡና የሚጠጣ ከሆነ ዋጋው ቀነሰ ብሎ 5-6 ወይም ሊጠጣ አይችልም፣ ኮንሱም የሚያደርግ አይችልም። For instance, a simple example. And among the many reasons, one of the reasons why the devaluation of the Ethiopian currency is not yet a solution for the import and export or the trade balance is the inelastic behavior of the Ethiopian commodity exports. ዋጋችን የኛ ሲቀንስ ከዶላር አንፃር ለውጭ ላሉ ሰዎች ሲቀንስ ብዙ በቀነሰው ልክ ብዙ ኮሞዲቲያችንን አይወስዱትም። ምክንያቱም አግሪካልቸራል ኮሞዲቲ ሀብታም ሆንኩ ብለህ እና ዋጋ ቀነሰ ብለህ አንድ እንጀራ ስበላይ ነበርኩ 5 እንጀራ የሚበላ ሰው የለም እንጂ። Therefore, among the many reasons is this one. Therefore, you have to clearly understand how the economy can be supported through the exchange rate market, particularly the foreign exchange markets. And there could be the possibility of controlling extreme movements in the foreign exchange market interaction between the domestic and the foreign currency. And the other point is sometimes there might be a trade-off between these targets. አንዱን ታርጌት አሳካለሁ ስትል አንደኛውን አሻሽላለሁ ስትል አንደኛውን ሊያባብስብህ ይችላል። For instance, unemploymentን ቀነስኩ ስትል ኢንፍሌሽን ሊበዛብህ ይችላል። For instance, ምንድነው ኤምፕሎይመንት ማለት ሰዎች ኤምፕሎይ ይሆናሉ ዘን ገቢ ያገኛሉ። ስለዚህ ያንን ብር ይዘው ወደ ገበያ ይወጣሉ for fulfilling their demand, right? ስለዚህ ብዙ ሰዎች ገቢ አግኝተው ወደ ገበያ በወጡ ቁጥር ሳፕላዩ በዛ ልክ አብሮ ፓራሌል ካልጨመረ የዋጋ ንረት ሊያስከትል ይችላል። Therefore, there might be a conflict among these goals. For instance, the price stability often conflicts with the goals of interest rate stability and high unemployment. But probably in the short run. Therefore, what could you do at that time? You could put an interaction in the priority. And I hope you remember the Phillips curve in your macroeconomic course. And because of these conflicting goals, sometimes the national bank or the central bank might be obliged to make a very critical and hard choices among the critical targets. Therefore, let's see the central bank strategy, how the central bank uses these targets. The ones that we have been discussing from 1 to 6 are not directly influenced by the central bank or the national bank. Therefore, it is possible to influence through its policy instruments or through set of tools. ስለዚህ ፕራይስ ስቴቢሊቲ፣ ኢምፕሎይመንት፣ ኢኮኖሚክ ግሮዝ ምናምን የሚሉት ጎሎችን ዳይሬክትሊ ሴንትራል ባንክ ኢንፍሉዌንስ የሚያደርጋቸዋል። ዳይሬክት ጎሉ አሉ። Therefore, but the central bank will influence through various policy instruments that we have seen in the inception of this discussion. For instance, the open market operations, for instance, changes in the discount rate, changes in the reserve requirement, that also affects the goals indirectly after a specified period of time. ስለዚህ በእነዛ ኢንስትሩመንቶች እነዛን ጎሎቹን ለምሳሌ ፕራይስ ስቴቢሊቲ፣ ኢኮኖሚክ ግሮዝ፣ ኢምፕሎይመንት የሚለውን በናሽናል ባንክ በአንድ ኢፌክቱን አያይም። ሜቢ ኢት ማይ ቴክ ኤ ታይም። ስለዚህ አንድ ፖሊሲ ኢንስትሩመንት ሜጀር ወስዳችሁ የዛን ውጤት ለማየት ረዘም ያለ ጊዜ ሊወስድ ይችላል። ስለዚህ አት ዘ ኤንድ ኦፍ ዘ ዴይ ደግሞ ሄዶ የዛ ኢፌክት ፌል ሊያደርግ ይችላል። therefore what could you do? You could have a mechanism to break into intermediate targets, and after its effect comes a long period of time, it may not be rational to make correction for its policy mistakes, and for that reason it might not be reversible. Therefore, the central banks usually pursue strategies for the achievement of these goals. And what did they do is as follows. First, there will be a decision on the level of the goals, for instance, for employment and the price level. Employment ምናምን የሚለው በብዛት በገቨርንመንት ኬስ ነው የሚወሰነው። Therefore, once these goals, for instance, the goal of high level of employment, the goals of specific level of price is set, then the central bank will choose a set of variables that is aimed for an intermediate target. Therefore, it will not have to wait for a year for checking its effectiveness. It will have an intermediate check by putting an intermediate target, so that it is possible to take a remedy at that intermediate period of time. And this intermediate target may be, for instance, put in terms of the money supply or the interest rate. and even these intermediate targets are not directly affected by the central bank's policy rules, for instance. Therefore, what it did is the central bank chooses another set of variables, and we call it as operating targets, or alternatively, they are called instruments. And by using these intermediate or operating targets, it is possible to quickly adjust whether its policies are running on the right track or there is a need to adjust within this intermediate period of time. Let's see an example. Suppose that the government has set a growth of 5% GDP. And this 5% growth of GDP will have a parallel goal set for the level of employment and the price level. And this 5%, for instance, might be, it is calculated as 4% growth in the money supply, that is M2, which can be set as an intermediate target. And this intermediate target will enable to achieve this 5%. And for achieving this 4% intermediate target, there might be the central bank's set of operating targets. For instance, 3.5% growth of the monetary base. And 3.5% of this monetary base can enable to achieve the 4% growth in the money supply, which is set as intermediate target, and aspire to achieve this 5% growth in GDP. And for achieving this 3.5% growth in monetary base, we will have this 3.5% of growth in monetary base. And after implementation of these operating targets, for achieving these intermediate targets, the central banks checks whether the monetary base have been increasing with the indicated percentage. If it is below that, it will take a remedy through maybe open market operations. In the same fashion, if it is above that, it will be corrected using the open market operations. Okay, now I will put you into group discussion. How many students do I have? 19 students. I'll put you into 5 groups. You will discuss this question. How can the National Bank of Ethiopia reduce the money supply using the following instruments: discount policy, reserve requirement, and open market operation? እነዚህን ኢንስትሩመንቶች በመጠቀም እንዴት ነው ለምሳሌ መኒ ሳፕላዩ በጣም በዝቷል ተብሎ just balance, just it is aimed to reduce the money supply. Therefore, how the national bank can reduce the money supply using these instruments? You will have 4 groups. You will discuss for 5 minutes, and then we will get back. automatically ነው ግሩፕ የሚያደርጋችሁ ስለዚህ መጀመር ትችላላችሁ ሮማን አዲሱ ደጀኔ ክብራብ ያሬድ ሩንቱ ድረስ ሰይድ ሁሴን አሁን ማለት ያሬድ ሸመ ሩም 3 አለባቸው የታነ ትክክል ጡፋ ስለዚህ ዲስከስ አድርጉ እኔ በየሩሙ እየገባው ፋሲሊቴት አደርጋቸዋለሁ well discussed all these policy instruments how the national bank can use them for managing the money supply one of the points here is it is assumed that the money supply is beyond the required therefore what the national bank is looking for is to summarize we have these 3 options and now how the national bank can reduce the money supply ስለዚህ በጀርባ ያለው አሳምሽ ምንድነው መኒ ሳፕላዩ ከሚገባው በላይ በኢኮኖሚው ተሰራጭቷል ማለት ነው ስለዚህ መኒ ሳፕላይ ሪዲዩስ ማድረግ ማለት ኢኮኖሚው ውስጥ የተሰራጨውን ገንዘብ እንዴት ነው የሚሰበስበው ማለት ነው ኢኮኖሚው ውስጥ ያለውን ኤክሰስ የሆነ ሳፕላይ ናሽናል ባንክ ወደ ራሱ መሰብሰብ ማለት ነው ይሄን ማድረጊያ መንገዶች ደግሞ ዳይሬክት ኤንድ ኢንዳይሬክት ሚል በመጀመሪያው አካባቢ ዲስከስ አድርገናል from these indirect policy instruments the discount policy the reserve requirement and the open market operation and most of you are clear with discount policy and when I revolve in each group some of you have asked me to more clarify how the reserve requirement and the open market operations are being functional reserve requirement አሁን እንግዲህ እናንተ እኔ ኢንቨስተር ማንንም ሰው ባንክ ወስዶ ገንዘቡን ዲፖዚት ያደርጋል እዛ ሴቭ ሲያደርግ ደግሞ ሴቪንግ ደግሞ የተለያዩ አይነት እንደሆኑ አይተናል በሁለተኛው ቀን ክላሳችን ኦን ዲማንድ ዊዝድሮ የሚደረጉ ወይም የተለያዩ አይነት ሴቪንግ ምናስቀምጣቸው አሉ ስለዚህ እዛ ሴቭ ከተደረገ ውስጥ እዛ ዲፖዚት ይሆናል ማለት ነው ኮመርሻል ባንክ ወስዳችሁ ንግድ ባንክ ልታስቀምጡ ትችላላችሁ የመረጣችሁት ንግድ ባንክ የሚባሉት እነ ዳሽን እነ ንግድ ባንክ ራሱ ወጋገን you can call all then what the national bank requires is he requires the commercial banks to put a portion of that deposit in the national bank ለምሳሌ ኮመርሻል ባንኮች ከሰበሰቡት ገንዘብ ውስጥ የተወሰነውን ፐርሰንቴጅ ናሽናል ባንክ ሪዘርቭ እንዲያደርጉት ናሽናል ባንክ ያስገድዳቸዋል ያ ማለት ምን ማለት ነው ሪዘርቭን ለምሳሌ ዲፖዚት ከተደረገ ውስጥ ከ20% ወደ 30% ከፍ ቢያደርገው ሪዘርቭ ሪኳየርመንት ምን ማለት ነው ከሰበሰቡት ውስጥ 30%ን ናሽናል ባንክ ላይ አስቀምጡ ማለት ነው ይሄንን ገንዘብ ሪዘርቭ ሪኳየርመንቱን ለብድር ወይም ለሌላ አገልግሎት መጠቀም አይችሉም ስለዚህ as the reserve requirement increases then the money supply will be reduced shrinking effect አለው ማለት ነው then we call it the reserve requirement has a shrinking effect on the money supply if the national bank has increased the reserve requirement ማለት ነው the other is the open market operation is you have securities for instance ስለዚህ ኢኮኖሚ ውስጥ የተሰራጨው ገንዘብ ብዙ ነው ብሎ ካሰበ security for instance on government, for instance, puts for instance, for financing, he has money deficit. Government, for instance, puts bonds, for instance. Bonds ሲሆን ምንድነው የሚያደርገው? ቦንዱን እየሸጠ ከሆነ then ገንዘቡን እየሰበሰበ ነው ማለት ነው. The money is getting to the government. In the same fashion, what the National Bank doing is he sells securities to you. Therefore, you take the securities and you give your money for some specific amount of interest rate that will be repaid you after a certain period of time. That's different. At that time, selling of securities will result in collecting of the money which is circulating in the economy and has the possibility of reducing the money supply. And that is clear for discount policy. It's related with the interest rate that is to be charged, right? Someone has texted me, does the unemployment necessarily mean where is chat? Does unemployment necessarily mean reducing the I have lost his text here. You can text it back. እዚህ ላይ ቴክስት አድርገ ነበር ጥያቄው ጠፋል ተመልሼ ስገባ ቴክስት ማድረግ ትችላለህ raise hand ያረክ I gave you the chance, okay, and you can ask.
Thank you, doctor. Reserve requirement ላይ ነው ጥያቄ ያለኝና
እሺ
ኢንቨስትመንት እና ይጎዳም ናሽናል ባንክ ሪዘርቭ ሪኳየርመንቱን ሃይ ባደረገ ቁጥር ኢንቨስትመንት ላይ ምን አይነት ኢፌክት ያመጣል? ምናልባት አሁን ትንሽ ባንኮች ላይ ምንድነው ያለው የሪዘርቭ ሪኳየርመንቱ ሃይ በሆነ ቁጥር የማበደር አቅማቸው ይቀንሳል። ካላበደሩ ደግሞ ያው ኢኮኖሚ ትንሽ አይንቀሳቀስም። ኢኮኖሚ ካልተንቀሳቀሰ አንኤምፕሎይመንትን ሃይሊ ሊፈጠር ስለሚችል ለመኒ ሰፕላይ እና ኢንቨስትመንቱን እንዴት ነው ማየት የምንችለው ለማለት ነው። Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amnisa. እዚህ ጋር አሁን ኮንሲደር ማድረግ ያለብን ናሽናል ባንክ መኒ ሳፕላይ ነው ማርኬት ኢኩሊብረም አለ። መኒ ማርኬት ኢኩሊብረሙ ዲማንዱ ከሳፕላዩ መሆን አለበት። ስለዚህ ሳፕላዩን ሪዲዩስ ማድረግ የፈለገበት ምናልባትም ኢኮኖሚ ውስጥ የተሰራጨው ከኢንቨስትመንት ዲማንዱ ወን ኢኮኖሚው ከሚፈልገው በላይ ገንዘቡ ተሰራጭቶ ነው ይችላል ከኦፕቲማል በላይ ማለት ነው እንጂ ልክ ነህ። ይሄ ሪዘርቭ ሪኳየርመንት ከፍ ባለ ቁጥር ባንኮች የማበደር አቅማቸው ይቀንሳል። ማበደር አቅማቸው ቀንሰ ማለት ደግሞ ኢንቨስትመንትን ሄዶ መልቲፕላየር ኢፌክት አለው። ግን ናሽናል ባንክ የሆነ ኦፕቲማል ሬት አለው። አሁን አንዳንዴ ባንኮች ገንዘቡን ስላገኙ ብቻ ዝም ብለው ይረጩታል። For instance, if you have the experience of hearing the development of Bank of Ethiopia, ብዙ ብድሮች የተበላሹ ኢኮኖሚው ከሚፈልገው በላይ ከሚሸከመው በላይ ገንዘቡን በብድር ሰጥተው ምን አይነት ሜስ እንደተፈጠረ የናሽናል ባንክ አውቶሪቲስ ኤክስፕሌንስ ያደረጉት ነበር ሰምታችሁ ከሆነ። ስለዚህ ናሽናል ባንክ ኦፕቲማል ዲሲዥን አለው ያን ያክል ኢንቨስትመንት በሚጎዳ መልኩ አይደለም ዲሲዥን የሚያካሂደው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ኤቭሪቲንግ ሃዝ ኦፕቲማሊቲ። ከተወሰነ በላይ የብድር ጣሪያም ይቀመጣል። ለምን ማክሮ ላይ ተምራችሁ ከሆነ አሴት ማርኬት ወይም ጉድስ ማርኬት በገንዘብ መለቀቁ ብቻ ታርጌት አይደለም፣ በጎን ይሄ ፕሮዳክሽን አብሮ መጨመር አለበት እንጂ ገንዘቡ ዝም ብሎ በብድር መልክ በገባ ቁጥርም necessarily ኢንቨስትመንት ሪተርን ላይ ያመጣ ይችላል። ስለዚህ ናሽናል ባንክ ያንን ኮንሲደር በማድረግ ነው መኒውን አጀስት የሚያደርገው ለኢኮኖሚው ጤናማነት ነው። ሌላው ሂዶ ኤምፕሎይመንት ምናምን ያልከው አንዳንዴ ስላይዱ ላይ ታስታውሱ ከሆነ sometimes በጣም ሃርሽ የሆነ ወይም ቬሪ ሃርድ የሆነ ዲሲዥን እንዲያካሄዱ ሪኩዌስት ሊደረጉ ይችላሉ። ለምሳሌ አንኤምፕሎይመንት ኤንድ ኢንፍሌሽን ለምሳሌ። ስለዚህ ሁለቱ ትሬድ ኦፍ የሚያደርጉ ነገሮች ናቸው። ስለዚህ sometimes the national bank might be forced to take a very hard action if it is not possible to jointly attain all the given objectives. ስለዚህ ኮምፒቲንግ የሆነና በጣም ትሬድ ኦፍ ያላቸው ሲሉ አንዳንዴ ተገደ ፕራዮሪቲ ያስቀምጣ አንዱን እንትመርጥበት ኬዝ ሊኖር ይችላል ማለት ነው። እና አይ ሆፕ ጥያቄን ያገኘሁት ይመስለኛል። there is optimality. አለባቸው
አቤት ዶክተር የኔ ጥያቄ አሁን ልክ ኤንቢ በዚህ በኩል ሪዲዩስ ካደረገ እነዚህን የፖሊሲ ኢንስትሩመንት ተጠቅሞ ኤክስቼንጅ ሬቱስ እንዴት ሊሆን ይችላል? በእኛ ኬስ ሲናሪዮ ይህን ባደረገ ቁጥር ገንዘብ በብዛት ካልወጣ ኤክስቼንጅ ሬቱ ሬዲዩስ ያደርጋል ብዬ አስባለሁ። ያን ሬዲዩስ ይችላል ምንድነው የሚያመጣው? ይሄ ከማርኬቱ ላይ ብዙ ገንዘብን መሰብሰብ ኤክስቼንጅ ሬቱ ጋር የሚያመጣ ኢፌክት ምንድነው? ቴንክ ዩ።
Okay. Of course, the exchange rate has its own rule. ኤክስቼንጅ ሬት የራሱ የሆነ ህግ አለው። ብዙ አይነት መንገድ ሊወሰን ይችላል። አንደኛ በገቨርንመንት ቀጥታ ጣልቃ ገብነት ፊክስድ ሊደረግ ይችላል። አንዳንዶች ደግሞ ፓርሻሊ የማርኬቱ ማኔጅ የሚባል አለ። በዛ መልኩ ሊሆን ይችላል። and these decisions are usually determined with reference to the exchange market. ራሱን የቻለ ማርኬት አለው ናሽናል ባንክ and this will be adjusted with the given import and your trade balance in general. Your trade balance and it is also dependent upon a specific policy. ስለዚህ ከነዚህኞች ፖሊሲ በወጣ መልኩ መንግስት ስፔሲፊክ አድርጎ ሊያስቀምጠው ይችላል ለብቻው ማለት ነው። መኒ አሁን ያኛው ከውጭ we are talking here in the domestic economy, but if you are talking about the exchange rate we are talking about the foreign market ማለት ነው። ፎሪን እና ዶሜስቲክ ማርኬት የኢንተርናሽናል ማርኬት ነው እያየን ያለ ነው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ that one will be determined objectively for the case of Ethiopia by the government. ስለዚህ ከመኒ ሳፕላይን በወጣ መልኩ በገቨርንመንት ኦብጀክቲቭሊ ነው ዲተርሚን እየተደረገ ያለው የኢትዮጵያ ከረንሲ ማለት ነው። እና እዚህ ጋር የምናካሄዳቸው መኒ ሳፕላይን ሪዲዩስ ማድረጉ ከኢንቨስትመንት አንፃር ከፎሪን ኤክስቼንጅ ጋር አሁን ዳይሬክትሊ ለማገናኘት in the case of Ethiopia it has some drawbacks because that is still determined by the national bank, not by the market. By market beyond something there might be a possible spillover effect on the on the exchange rate ማለት ነው። Any other? If you have if I am not clear you can I can clarify it more. አሁን የውጭ ሀገርና የኤክስቼንጅ ሬት የሚለው የውጭ ሀገርና የሀገር ውስጥ ገንዘብ ለኢንተርናሽናል ትሬድ ያለው ኢፌክት ነው። አሁን የኛ መንግስት በብዛት ኢምፖርት ስለሚበዛ ኢምፖርት ሊሚት ለማድረግ የውጭ ሀገር ኮሞዲቲዎች ለኛ ውድ እንዲሆኑ የኛ ኮሞዲቲዎች ደግሞ ለውጭ ሀገር ርካሽ እንዲሆኑ በሚል ነው ዲቫልዩ እያረጋ ያለው ማለት ነው። እና ያ it is determined by the national bank. Okay, if no question, let's finish today's session here. See you. Bye-bye.
ልዩነት መፍጠር ዓላማችን ነው። ዓለም አቀፍ ተወዳዳሪ መሆን አለባችሁ። የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ጥራትና ደረጃውን የጠበቀ ስልጠና በመስጠት ብቁ ዜጋ እያፈራን ነው። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ፣ በቲኬቲንግና ሪዘርቬሽን፣ በሆቴልና ቱሪዝም ሙያዎች አሰልጥነን ተወዳዳሪ እናደርጉታለን። ኮሌጃችን ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ICM ጋር በመተባበር ዓለም አቀፍ ዕውቅና ያለው ስልጠና እየሰጠ ይገኛል። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ የምንሰጣቸው ስልጠና ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና አለው። አድራሻ ከጎላጉል ታወር 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።